Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed.
Hi, I'm Susan Bateman.
And I'm Jim Bateman.
I opened the Yarn Barn in Lawrence, Kansas in 1971 with a handful of yarns and a few tools.
And now we have over 8 tons of weaving yarn, 108 knitting yarn lines, and hundreds of variations of knitting needles and crochet hooks. In 2024, we shipped over 10,000 packages to all 50 states.
In 2025, we'd love to ship one to you. Visit us at yarnbarn-ks.com.
I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Ann Merrow. Gabi van Tassell is the designer of the Turtle Loom hexagonal pin loom and weaving projects using a variety of pin loom shapes. So, Gabi van Tassell, thank you for being with us.
Hi there.
Now, I think that a lot of people, when they think about pin looms, just think about squares. And you have really explored what it means to have a not square pin loom. Can you tell me a little bit about your pin looms?
Thank you very much. Yes, of course. Originally, that was in the 1930s when pin looms really became pin looms. They were square. And initially, there was only a 4x4 square, and that was it. And then people, a few decades, ventured out and came up with like 2x4 and 4x6. Wow, this is exciting. But then there was a very long stretch of nothingness until some loom makers came up with the idea of making a triangle. And the key, I think, to having more shapes is very much that you can make gazillions of shapes, but that does not mean that you know how to weave them. And I think that's what is changing now. I am making hexagon looms, yes. And the reason for that was that my daughter, over a decade ago, she took weaving classes with a professional weaver. And she was too young to drive, so I was just sitting there. And this professional weaver had this most beautiful grandmother's flower garden quilt hanging there and made of all those tiny little hexagons. And I was just sitting there, and I had my was probably a Weave-It or Weave-It with me at the time, and just weaving along, minding my own business. And then I thought, wow, this is like, I really, really, really want to make hexagons because the size is right. These are tiny contained pieces of fabric. And I wonder how I can make hexagons. And Google did not tell me how to do it because nobody else, well, there were people that were doing it, but in a very, I don't want to call it quirky, but kind of a not very convenient fashion. So I just started playing around until at some point I figured out if I combine different weaving methods into one. So I start with one weaving method and then I finish with another weaving method, I can weave hexagons. And that was, I think by now I call it a breakthrough because that opens the door to so many more shapes that can be woven. And there are still a whole bunch of them that can be explored.
So you mentioned that you can make a lot of different shapes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one can weave them. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Oh, absolutely. Technology-wise, particularly with today's technology, you can make all kinds of fancy shapes. You can make the shape of a horse and put some pins in it, but that doesn't mean that you can weave a horse. Because if you want to follow the concept of warp and weft, it's not always easy to get all the curves or the corners and do it, particularly not in one piece, but even sometimes in multiple pieces. There are just shapes that are technically possible to make as a loom, but not very intuitive to actually put the thread on and make a warp weft fabric. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I remember seeing, I think it was a little insect, and it was a very cute little insect loom, but what came off it, I wouldn't have been able to join to anything else.
That is correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is called a pin loom. And I think you mean the dragonfly. I know that very well. And that's kind of, yes, it's a pin loom, but it's kind of a free form weaving that follows a pattern. And it's not the creating fabric in a warp weft sense.
Yeah. So it seems like this quilt inspiration and creating fabric was an important part of developing your loom.
Yes, absolutely. One of my personal sayings is that I like pretty and practical things. So, and with that, this is garment creation or home decor or blankets or what have you. And for that, yes, I would need fabric.
Did you sew before you learned to weave?
The list of things that I did not try is probably shorter than the list of things that I did try when it comes to fiber crafts. I have never been anything professional fiber crafter, but I grew up with fiber people around me. And so, yes, I knit, I crochet, I weave, I sew, I embroider, all of the above.
You mentioned that there's actually 2 different kinds of weaving that you need to do to make a hexagon. What are those 2 different kinds?
For weaving a hexagon, you start with continuous strand weaving as if you might know this, as if you were to weave a square. But then you stop half the way through and switch to traditional back and forth weaving to finish the center of the hexagon.
So it's almost as though you took a square and rotated it, say 45 degrees, so that you were going to weave it on the bias.
Yep.
And yeah. Oh, okay.
Okay.
There's a video podcaster that I follow who talks about how hexagons are the bestagons. And that's because in nature, hexagons are so useful.
Oh, absolutely.
They fit together so well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is like they are geometrically strong and the least space taking. That's why you have the beehives. And it's absolutely mind boggling how nature makes use of hexagons. At the same time, it's also interesting that they are extremely, I would not say complex, but if you look at the geometry of hexagons, and that's where some people really get lost when you put hexagons together, or, hexagon by nature has 6 corners. If you put a hexagon in half, first of all, there are 2 ways to cut it in half. And one time you get a pentagon with 5 points, and the other time you get a piece with 4 points.
Right. Okay.
And so
I'm just doing this in my mind.
I know.
Yeah.
It is, I think this is a true case where you can say hexagons are mind boggling. So
yeah,
quite entertaining, very fascinating, but yeah, definitely a very interesting and complex natural adventure.
So was the hexagon loom the first one that you developed then?
Yes, the hexagon loom was the first one I developed. That's correct.
And ever since then, you've been working with variations on that. You have diamonds, you have jewels, you have elongated hexagons. How do you think about what different shapes to make?
It's kind of a pretty simple thing. They just come to me. And basically, if I look at projects and I need something, I see if I can weave it. And probably the most interesting one and a direct evolution from the hexagon is the jewel loom. The jewel loom is another loom for which I combine 2 weaving methods. I start with bias weaving a square, and then the second half of the jewel is actually woven like a triangle, a bias triangle. And that those 2 together, if you combine them at the right time with the right spacing, you get a jewel.
And the jewel it's kind of like, it's not, when we think about it, a geometric diamond, we often think of kind of like a rhombus or a squished square, but the jewel is kind of a diamond, right, in that it's faceted. It's kind of has a long point, and then how would you describe a jewel?
It's actually not a diamond. A jewel is a pentagon.
Okay.
A pentagon, so there are 5 sides, but one tip is kind of pulled out and it kind of looks like a drop shape.
Okay. So, in addition to developing this kind of unusual loom, you kind of had to develop projects to show people what they could do with it.
Yes, and this is one of my dilemma, that I have so many project ideas and simply not the time to make them all. You asked before why I came up with different shapes, and the hexagon is pretty much self-contained, but you might want to, for example, let's just stick with the hexagon for a minute here. We talked about cutting hexagons in half.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, if you cut them along the longest side, you get a trapezoid.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And if you put 3 trapezoids or 2 trapezoids together, it makes a hexagon. So there are a whole bunch of things you can play with colors. Like if you put different trapezoid colors together, it still makes the hexagons, and then you can combine those hexagons with regular hexagons. And there's just, there's so much that you can do. If we go back to the hexagons and cut that into 3 pieces, that's when you get diamonds. So 3 diamonds make a hexagon.
Huh.
Yes.
And did you play with paper and scissors to work on this, or pencil and paper? How do you think about these things?
I start with paper and pencil and just scribble it, and it looks awful. And then I have a software that's called Easy or EQ7 or 8 by now, which is a quilter software. And they allow me to play with shapes. So once I have the idea or the ideas, I very often go and use that software to lay it out and play with colors. And I use that also when I write my patterns.
I imagine it is a lot like quilting in that color is such an important part of it.
Yes, it's very, very much like quilters. And often when I talk to people that like quilting, I explain pin loom weaving to them that, hey, you know what? You don't cut your pieces, but you weave them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to them that clicks, and they say, oh, I can just weave my diamonds or hexagons. And I said, yes, you can do that. It allows you to do different things. Like, for example, one thing that's very popular in quilting is that people cut out certain fabric patterns in a certain way. So there are limitations when it comes to pin loom weaving. On the other hand, with pin loom weaving, if you do use different yarns, you achieve effects that are surprisingly beautiful in quilts that you probably don't get with bought fabric.
That's true. You can, and people think about fussy cutting in quilting, and you can fussy cut in with yarn too. You can take out the part that you don't like, or work just to include the colors that you love.
Yes,
weaving.
absolutely. And with pin loom weaving there is this you never know what you get when you use variegated yarns.
Oh,
so
right.
there is never one piece like the other. And so if you just weave up a bunch and you shove them around until you have something beautiful that you like, it's totally unique.
I would imagine, though, that with the looms that ask you to do 2 different kinds of weaving, that the color progression would be even a little bit less predictable, because it's not the over-under the same way uniformly.
Yes. If you have done enough of them, you get kind of a clue. But yes, I do see that actually right now, where I'm working a little bit more with hexagons and pentagons, or with the jewel shapes. The same yarn on hexagon and jewel shape has still different effects. And I don't think there's an end to exploring on how that actually turns out. And that's where it gets also, for example, you get a plaid effect, a beautiful plaid effect, but it depends on the color run in the yarn, on what plaid effect you get. And then it depends on the loom that you use it on, what the plaid effect will look like. So it gets very complex. If you want to plan something that way, that might be a little bit more difficult, but playing around and exploring and just going for it and then picking what you like, wow, it's endless possibilities.
And one of the fun things about working with a pin loom is that you can experiment with such a finite length of yarn, size of item, and you don't have to put on 4 yards or even 2 yards and weave a whole lot to get to experiment and play around.
Oh, absolutely. And two things on that one. I have a bunch of customers that use our looms to make quick samples because, for example, a lot of indie dyers, people who dye their yarns, because within minutes you can weave up a little sample. And even if that's sold to knitters or so, people get the color effect. So there's a contained piece of fabric that you can post or even give to your customers quickly that gives them a good idea on how the fabric will feel or what it will look like. And then the second thing is that I, from my end, provide pin looms. So the same size hexagon loom, for example, but for different sets. So for different weight yarns. And that's another thing that has become very popular, even with floor loom weavers or multi-shaft loom weavers. I can tell them, okay, the regular set is 7.5 ends per inch. And then the fine set is 10 ends per inch. And the extra fine set is 12 ends per inch. And people, even if they have a different set that they finally will weave on, it gives them a good idea on what a yarn would work up at. So to give them a quick idea, and again, this is something that they can have in minutes to say, oh yeah, this yarn will feel good as a fabric, or what set to start with.
One of the things that I like about your looms and hexagon weaving is, and the thing that made me eventually buy one because I just couldn't resist how nicely the hexagons finished together. There was a blanket using turtle loom hexagons, and I always have trouble seaming the edges of the 3-pin style pin looms. I know that there are folks who have beautiful, elegant methods, and mine come out looking a little bit more lumpy. And so when I looked at the hexagons, you could just join them so nicely edge to edge, and they made a beautiful reversible fabric.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the benefit of combining weaving methods. Many of them are bias. For example, the jewel shape is all bias square and bias triangle. And they have those little curvy edgings where you have the loops that you can pick up quickly when you sew them together, but in a straight line. And that is actually interesting that when people complain about the 3-pin grouped squares that they are making, and that it takes extra effort, let me say it that way, to put them together neatly. That is actually a thing that has been an issue since the 1930s when that loom was developed. I recently pulled out, it's probably the first bias. It's a very quirky weaving method, but it was patented in the late 1930s. And one of the benefits that was listed in that patent was that it makes it easier for people to join the pieces because of the 3-pin grouped issues that were even known at that time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, I think I've kind of jumped over an important point here, which is that at some point you went from saying, what if I could weave a hexagon to here I am weaving hexagons, but we've sort of skipped the part in the middle where you decided to build a different loom style and make them for other people. Can you tell me how that process came about?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's quite an interesting story. I'm a person who likes to share and to teach and to help people to make things, pretty and practical things. And once I had figured out how to do it for myself, I wanted to share it with other pin loom weavers. And to me, so I actually, when I first started, went out and approached all the pin loom weavers at the time and said, here, I have a new system on how you can make hexagons. Can you make me the looms? And at the time, everybody whom I'm asking were, for different reasons, nobody was ready to jump on board. So because I knew that people would like the looms, I started to make my own. And at the same time, this is also when I decided to patent the idea, because I had never made a loom. I have done woodworking and a whole bunch of other things, but I have never made a loom and was completely not set up to offer them to anybody. So I decided to patent the idea to buy me some time so that I can grow a small business and be able to tell my story. And yeah, that's how it all started, the Bluebonnet Crafters and the turtle looms. And my children at that point were still helping. That's why the turtles are called turtles. And so basically I started making my own looms. And initially I thought this is like, yeah, whoever kind of wants to have some, I can make that. I can make those looms for them. And then they became very, very popular, probably not just because I provided the looms, but also how to use them and what to make with them. So for me, it was really an opportunity to tell my story and get people excited and share with people. But that's how Bluebonnet Crafters and the turtles came about.
So you started by making them at home then? Just
Oh,
a
yeah.
few at a time?
Yep. I I made them at home. And initially, this was an extremely cumbersome, very, very, very manual method. And then when I realized that this would just not work if I wanted to make more than 2 looms a day,
Wow. Yeah.
I actually reached out. There is an organization called SCORE. I'm not sure if you have heard of them.
I haven't.
This is retired business executives that help
Mhm.
small businesses to get off their feet. And they are
Clever.
nationwide. I knew them from when I lived in New England, but when I came here, this was like, okay, maybe those people can help me to find. I'm just looking for somebody, for a woodworker who can help me make the bases. I put in the pins and what have you, that I can do that. So through SCORE, and this was basically a wild goose chase of networking. I talked to like people who build kitchen cabinets and people at the commerce department and here and there. And finally somebody said, oh yeah, I know somebody who might be able to help you. And so this, I know somebody was actually able to help me. He has a CNC router machine. What that means is it allows you to cut out the loom bases with the holes marked in the right places so that I have the total accuracy for my looms. And then I still take them home, and they are sanded and lacquered and sanded and lacquered and sanded and lacquered on our
Oh my
back
goodness.
porch. And
Oh
then
wow.
I put the nails in the garage, and that's what makes the looms. So now I
Wow.
work with somebody who cuts out the bases for me on a
Mhm.
CNC router, and then
Mhm.
I do the rest here at home.
I was trying to remember what that stands for, and I believe it's something like computer numeric control, and
Yes.
it's the computer programs the mill to cut the holes precisely.
It cuts the frames first, and then you switch the tools to a drill, and then it drills the holes. And I like it because it gives me absolute accuracy in one step, and then I can craft it from there.
I had no idea that there was still an element of this that you are making one by one at home, given how many other projects you're working on.
I know, and this is a little bit of a problem, but so far I manage. And that's kind of true for all pin loom weavers. It's very difficult to grow a business in the pin loom space. And this is why you see most pin loom makers are family businesses. Because as soon as you have to add personnel or even a small factory place, it's very, very difficult. And it would just, I actually at some point when I was talking about when I started, I went to loom makers and asked if they can make them for me. I actually spoke with Schacht at the time, with Jane Patrick, and I'm forever grateful for her because she gave me some really, really good tips. For example, where to get the pins. But, at the time, it was just not cost efficient to have them made on such a scale. That's true. That remains true. I have been looking for the last several years to hire people, but it's very, very difficult to find people that are skilled in that space that are willing, even at a reasonable pay, to work at a reasonable pay to make those looms. So it's pretty much tied to family businesses, and you do what you can.
Right. The 3-pin style pin looms themselves were very difficult to find for decades. And I know that there were several small companies that were trying to create them in wood. And when Schacht was able to do them with their composite frame, I think that really made a difference for making pin looms generally more accessible and making people think that this was a creative avenue that they should explore in lots of different directions. How do you handle prototyping? Because it wasn't that one day, amazingly, you had what your finished product would be. I'm sure there are all kinds of different iterations and you do woodworking, but somehow there had to be something between the idea and what you have now. How do you handle those in-between steps?
Oh, those in-between steps, a lot of wood scraps.
Yes.
And a very patient CNC meister. So, and it's really, I start on paper with pen and paper. And sometimes I kind of just draw the lines. This is like, how can I actually weave this, let's say, the jewel shape? And this is like tons of paper until I have a line, an uninterrupted line that allows me to weave that shape. And then comes a prototype. Sometimes I start or most of the times, I just start with a piece of wood with nails in it and then use the nails that I have there to make the shape. And when I have that figured out, it comes to, okay, how far apart do the nails actually need to be to create a plain weave fabric, an evenly set fabric? And that can get that takes several iterations usually to get that right, particularly if you have more than one weaving method. And then lastly, I have several iterations still on scrap wood to get the right feel. I like my looms to feel right and that they are comfortable to use. For example, with some of the looms, the diamond loom, for example, has the last set of pins set a little bit farther apart so that it's easier to work with the tool. If you just look at the geometry, they should be closer together, but then it's much more difficult to work with a weaving tool. So I shape them to make weaving comfortable. And then when I have that prototype, that's usually when I go to my CNC meisters and say, hey, can you make me a prototype? And then usually there's a video conference of several hours where we say, no, I don't want it that way. And do you want it this way? And how deep and how far and which pins and this and that. So there's a couple of hours or so where we do video conferencing, and then he sends me a prototype. I put in the nails, try it out and say, yep, or no, we need to change this and that. And that's usually when we say, okay, it's a go.
It hadn't even occurred to me that you have to make decisions about how far apart the pins are spaced. Because when you're working with something besides a rectangle, besides a square that has perfectly symmetrical points along the edge, you have to think about if this is closer together, will it make the set uneven in one area than another? It's very complex.
Yes, it is. And you can see that particularly on the jewel loom, for example, where the jewel loom has this, it has the same size as the hexagon loom, but on one side, it has one more pin than the hexagon, because at that point, I'm using a weaving method different from the hexagon, and that creates a different fabric. That has a different intake. So I needed one more pin on that one side to get an even fabric in the end piece.
Wow. Have you practiced other forms of weaving?
A little bit. I have done the big triangle weaves where you make all the shawls and things like that. And I have Leclerc floor loom with 4 shafts.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter has been much more into it than I do. So I'm not proficient in any of them, but kind of just tinkering around with a lot.
I was just curious about how you think about the over-under element of it, and whether that was something that you thought about from banging out yards and yards of plain weave, or something that is very much not only pick by pick, but thread by thread.
Well, I blame this on the fact that I'm trained in thinking in zeros and ones.
Oh, I see. You have a digital background.
Yes, I do. And I think there's just so much, there are so many overs and unders in our lives that weaving is just a very natural, basic component of our lives. And yes, I spent a few decades in digital land and corporate high tech.
Yes.
And a lot of the patterns, the pattern thinking is very similar there. And if you ask my Latin teacher, she actually claims that this is all because she taught me Latin so well, because it's kind of, there's a lot of simple structure and logic and rules. And I'm basically just reusing all of that knowledge.
But then at the same time, we're talking about over under, but a lot of your designs are, embrace a lot of circle, the way that you can put these shapes together to make a circle, or make something that's, an unusual form of symmetry, or that are almost tiled in a particular way. So I'm just curious, do you think of designing looms and designing fabric as being related, or are they sort of different for you?
That's actually quite an interesting question. I think designing looms came first, and then what you can make with those shapes. Well, actually, that's a really good question, because the inspiration to make a hexagon loom came from this grandmother's flower garden, a quilt design, which is floral, but it's all hexagons. But at the same time, now that I have more shapes like the diamonds and the squares and the jewels and the hexagons, I find myself very often just tinkering around with playing my looms and like, oh, look at that. And you can make that. And, last year when I did the trapezoid loom, honestly, I did not have, I came to that with, okay, I need a half hexagon to make straight borders on my hexagon pieces. And then when I had the trapezoid, it was like, oh, you can make that. And oh, you can make that. And look at that. You can make braid shapes or pinwheel shapes. And So if you just start tinkering around, this is like, you may find amazing things.
So, what have other people made with your looms that you've thought was particularly exciting or interesting?
Oh my goodness. I actually have a whole folder of things with customer projects that wowed me. I simply don't have the time to put them all out, but I started making customer showcase vlogs and want to get back to that. There's anything from little dolls or even just tiny, tiny turtles. Or I have one customer who has an Indian background, and he has the, you know, how in Indian art you have all this floral, beautiful shapes that you can make. And he made this huge blanket out of penny looms. So the smallest hexagon looms,
Uh-huh.
just with these Indian floral shapes. And this is absolutely stunning. I have seen some beautiful blankets, garments, like a ruana or just a simple stole. And it's, I don't think there's really kind of one mainstream thing. There's just a whole bunch of really, really beautiful things that customers come up with. Another idea from that a customer did that very much impressed me. This was actually during COVID, and she made a blanket or a wall hanging with the COVID deaths. So it gives you goosebumps when you see this, but with COVID deaths every day in the nation during COVID, and you could see the waves, you could see the, this like which COVID strand there came and went. And that was so basically just to express yourself with hexagons. Very, very impressive ideas that people come up with.
That sort of weaving a particular shape over and over does invite a sort of a journal or a daily practice element of it. And people talk about temperature afghans or the project that you just mentioned. That element of it could really invites itself to having a pin loom at your side and saying, this is my piece of the day, my
Yes,
hex of the day. Mm-hmm.
yes, absolutely. Since people have, it's very difficult. The temperature blankets are actually quite popular for all kinds of pin looms because you weave a small piece of fabric and you put them to that expresses the temperature or your feeling of the day, and you put them together into a blanket. Perfect application for pin looms. But I also encourage people that cannot make the commitment for such a large project to do, I call them the no stress projects.
Mm-hmm.
When you just weave a little piece of fabric when you feel like it,
Mm-hmm.
or, maybe on a day you have a little bit more time, or you don't feel well and you just want to weave. So you weave 5 or 6 or what have you. And then it's summer and the sun is out and you spend the time at the beach, you just weave one in a whole week. And then, so basically just to make you feel good and enjoy the process. And then whatever you get, you sew them together into a project and you let it be whatever it is. So this may be just the very enthusiastic weaver weaves one piece and then nothing for the rest of the year. And then they have a coaster. It's still a project.
Mm-hmm.
And others kind of just weave, or they weave up yarn scraps from other projects. And you just put them together as you go. Some people have a table runner, some people have a ruana, some people make a blanket, and it's patchwork. It's a wild collection of things. But the nice thing there is that each piece has a story to tell. And I find this so absolutely calming when you're really with no stress. You just weave when you feel like it, and with materials that you have at hand or that you find or that mean something to you. And then you have something that tells you a story, one piece at a time. So I encourage every pin loom weaver to do something like that. Just a complete no stress patchwork project. Let it be whatever it is, and no finish, or you decide when it's finished. and it has stories to tell. I think that's one of the most wonderful project ideas that pin loom weaving has to offer.
And unlike my knitting needles or my other kinds of looms, you can make one and then it's fresh for the next piece. You don't have to, it's not a many day commitment. You can work on one and then move on. But that doesn't stop people from buying multiple pin looms. I know folks have a lot of pin looms.
Oh yeah. But I do understand your parallel to knitting. This is like, I
Mm-hmm.
will not ask you officially how many sets of knitting needles you have.
Mm-hmm. And I used to ask people how many looms they have, but then when people really started weaving on pin looms, it just became a meaningless number because I have a 4-inch, I have a 2-inch, I have a 1-inch.
There is this collector's effect that has
Sure.
become popular over the last year. So what I recommend to people is like very often when you have the enthusiastic new pin loom weaver, they come and say, okay, what looms, plural, do I need to buy? And I usually tell them, think of one thing that you would like to make. And then you get that one loom or maybe 2 looms, and then you make that project. And while you explore pin loom weaving, number one, you'll find out if it's for you. But while you explore pin loom weaving, you will find out what to make next. And then you go for that loom. So I do not encourage people to buy 10 or 20 looms from the get-go, but really explore looms and then decide which loom to get next.
That is very good and also surprising advice from someone who makes looms for other folks.
I will never get rich with making my looms, but I'm pretty much, for me, it's an outlet to share a beautiful craft with people.
Speaking of sharing, I think one of the really cool parts about pin loom weaving is that there's very active social media, Facebook groups, etc. There's a lot of sharing among folks who are finding new projects to make with these looms.
Yes, absolutely. We have a really good group on Facebook and a really good group on Ravelry. And maybe you can add the links to the description of this
Absolutely.
podcast,
Mhm.
where it's also, these are very friendly groups. There is no competition in pin loom weaving. We can all enjoy it together. We can share ideas. We can help each other. I think that's so much more important than having the stress of regular life.
Mhm. Yeah. And there are a lot of wonderful designers who are making projects with it. I just flipped to a project from spring 2023 Little Loom. So 2 years ago, one of my favorite projects was from Greta Holmstrom, who developed this. She calls it the feathered poncho. And the cool thing is that it takes the 2-dimensional 6-sided shape and turns it into a 3-dimensional square with little feathers.
Yes, absolutely. And by
Yeah.
the way, that was one of the mind-boggling projects that somebody else but me made. This is like to have this scalloped effect, I think is absolutely brilliant. And you can use it for the poncho, which is absolutely beautiful, but you can use it for so many things. If you don't want to make a big poncho, you can use the same method on a pillow cover, for example. So there are so many ways, because it's so modular, you can make any shapes and different projects as you go and as you want.
So you said that you advise people to find a project that they want to make and buy the looms for it. When somebody's just starting off, what other advice do you give them?
If somebody knows how to spell pin loom weaving, but otherwise has so basically a beginner,
Mm-hmm.
I do recommend that they start with the Schacht Zoom loom, because it's a really good method to get a good feeling for what pin loom weaving is all about. To understand layering and weaving, there's also a really, really broad spectrum of woven pattern and pattern projects. It's the most popular thing. So the other thing is it's squares. So when you put them together, yes, there are the scalloped edges, but can be a little bit more difficult, but even there are ways to deal with it. But it's easier for people to think in two directions and then squares and put squares together. If they say, yes, but I want a hexagon loom, then I do recommend that they start with the original size, which is, it has about 4 inches in size, because it introduces very easily to the principles of continuous strand weaving. And it creates pieces of fabric that are very comfortable to put together into a gazillion of different projects. So I have people in both areas, but that's a really good start. If you are brand new to pin loom weaving, these are my 2 recommendations.
It really is a little bit different, though. I mean, the form factor of the Zoom loom with the pins and the instructions for making the layers is terrific, and the continuous strand weaving really is different. And it took me a little while to figure out how to make that work. And then the part that you're doing in between is not the same for, say, the turtle loom as it is for the Zoom loom, because you're doing one over, one under, right? It's not 2 in each direction that you're working with.
Yes, with hexagon loom weaving, you have pretty much a little bit of everything. So there is the continuous strand, there is the over and under, but then there's the over and under in a bias fashion where you weave in rounds.
Okay.
Where you, for example, build the warp while you are weaving, which is different from the traditional, you warp first and then you weave. So, and with the Zoom loom, you have the layers where you lay them out and then only weave the last layer. But there you weave pretty much all the layers together. So it's kind of, I don't think there's really kind of a one road to truth on pin loom, which is also what's sometimes confusing to people who come from a multi-shaft weaving, where it's pretty clearly laid out. You have the warp and the weft, and you can manipulate both of them, but you always have the warp and the weft. And then comes bias weaving, and all of a sudden you're supposed to weave in circles.
Right. And it's not like too many warp threads on a floor loom or a rigid heddle loom turn around and suddenly decide to become weft threads.
I know. Yep, you got it.
Yeah. Great. Well, Gabi, you've made me really want to go and pull out my little sweet turtle loom and make some hexagons. So thank you so much.
Go for it. Thank you for this wonderful chat.
Oh, thank you for being here. And I am so excited to see what you do next.
All right. You will be one of the first to know.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.